The Reyes family had always dismissed their great-grandfather's leather journal as the rambling obsession of a man who'd spent too long alone in the Chihuahuan wilderness. But when Maria inherited the faded notebook, along with her grandmother's jewelry box, she noticed something her predecessors had overlooked, a hand-drawn map tucked between pages describing a sacred Tarahumara shrine, hidden somewhere in the labyrinth of canyons south of Creel. The map included landmarks, a stone shaped like an eagle's head, a river that ran red during certain seasons, symbols carved into cliff faces, all rendered with the precision of someone who had actually stood at those locations. Maria's younger brother Luis was skeptical. He'd built a successful construction business in Mexico City and had no interest in chasing ghosts in the mountains. But when their cousin Diego arrived from Oaxaca with archaeological credentials and a hunger for undocumented indigenous history, the family's curiosity shifted. Diego argued that a genuine pre-Hispanic shrine, if documented properly, could provide crucial insights into Tarahumara spiritual practices during the colonial period. More than that, it could prove the family's legitimacy as descendants of the region, something their grandmother had always hinted at, but never confirmed. Within weeks, they hired a local guide named Tomas, a man in his 60s who'd grown up in the canyons and knew its moods like an old sailor knows the sea. He warned them immediately. The terrain was unforgiving, the rainy season was approaching, and strangers asking questions about indigenous sites attracted attention from people who didn't ask many of their own. Still, he agreed to lead them. The map was good, he said, very good, which meant either their great-grandfather had been blessed with unusual luck or he'd been guided by someone who knew these canyons intimately. The family gathered their supplies: ropes, climbing gear, flashlights, water bottles, notebooks for documentation. Maria studied the journal obsessively, marking each clue. Luis arranged leave from his business, troubled by a feeling he couldn't shake, that they were disturbing something meant to stay hidden. Diego packed a camera and measuring instruments, already planning the academic paper he'd write. None of them realized, as they boarded the truck toward the Sierra Madre, that someone else had been watching the Reyes family's movements for months, waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. Chapter 1. The Eagle's Head. The first marker took them 2 days to find. According to the map, it should have been visible from the main canyon trail, a rock formation resembling an eagle in profile, wings spread wide. But decades of erosion and the sheer scale of the landscape made certainty impossible. What looked like an eagle from one angle became a jumbled mass of stone from another. Tomas moved through the terrain with the confidence of someone who'd walked these paths his entire life, his weathered face scanning the walls methodically. On the morning of the 3rd day, he stopped abruptly. "There," he said quietly, pointing toward a cliff face that rose nearly 200 meters, its surface scarred by ancient weathering. And then Maria saw it. The profile, unmistakable once you knew where to look. The eagle was massive, its beak jutting outward, its wings folded along the stone like they were resting before flight. The formation sat precisely where the map indicated, marked by a small X in their great-grandfather's careful handwriting. Diego immediately began photographing and measuring, calling out dimensions to Luis, who recorded them in a notebook. But Maria felt something different, a weight in her chest that made breathing heavier than the altitude alone could explain. She found herself thinking of her great-grandfather, wondering what he'd felt standing in this exact spot, knowing something sacred lay hidden nearby. Had he been afraid? Had he experienced a moment where he questioned whether the search was worth the cost? Tomas crouched near the base of the formation, his fingers tracing something in the stone. A symbol, 3 concentric circles with a cross dividing them into quarters, not carved deeply but worn smooth by centuries of weather and touch. "Tarahumara," Tomas said, his voice respectful. "Old, very old." He touched the symbol again, almost reverently, before standing and pointing deeper into the canyon. The river should be 2 kilometers northeast. That's where the map takes us next. As they broke camp and reorganized their gear, neither Maria nor the others noticed the dust cloud rising in the distance or the figures moving parallel to their position along the upper canyon ridge. Tomás noticed, though. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and he increased their pace without explanation, knowing that finding the shrine before sunset might become significantly more urgent than any of them had anticipated. Chapter 2. The Red River. The river appeared suddenly, revealed as they rounded a bend where the canyon widened into a natural amphitheater. It wasn't large, perhaps 15 meters across, but it ran with a murky, rust-colored water that seemed to glow orange where sunlight struck it. Iron oxide, Diego said immediately, running tests on the water temperature and pH. The geological explanation was straightforward. Mineral deposits from upstream deposits created this phenomenon, likely during the rainy season when water volume increased and churned the mineral-rich sediment. But the locals called it the Red River for different reasons, Tomás explained. In their oral traditions, the color represented the blood of warriors who'd refused Spanish conversion, who'd fled into these canyons rather than surrender. The color was a memorial, a permanent mark on the land itself. The map indicated they should cross the river and follow its course northeast for approximately 3 kilometers. The water ran faster than it appeared, its current carrying debris, broken branches, leaves, occasionally larger stones that tumbled along the rocky bottom. Luis tested the depth with a fallen branch, finding it roughly waist-deep at the center point. They could cross, but it would require care and coordination. Tomás led the way, moving deliberately, his feet finding purchase on submerged rocks. The cold shocked Maria as water rose to her thighs, then her waist. The current tugged insistently, testing her balance. Luis steadied her from behind, while Diego crossed last, gripping Maria's outstretched hand as he stepped from the water onto the eastern bank. It was there, standing in the spray of the river, that Diego spotted it, a pattern of stones arranged deliberately along the bank, partially submerged. Not random, not natural. 3 stones in a perfect triangle aligned with the canyon wall. A marker. Confirmation that their great-grandfather hadn't been the first to follow this path, and that whoever had come before had left deliberate guides for those worthy of finding them. Tomás saw the stones too. He exchanged a look with Maria that she couldn't quite interpret. Acknowledgement, perhaps, or warning. He began moving again, more urgently now, following a narrower trail that climbed away from the river. Behind them, still keeping distance, the figures on the ridge had stopped moving. They were waiting. But waiting for what? Chapter 3. The symbols. By late afternoon, they'd climbed nearly 300 meters through switchbacks and narrow passages where the canyon walls seemed to lean inward, creating a natural tunnel through the rock. The air cooled noticeably as they ascended, and the stone beneath their feet changed character, smoother, less fractured, almost deliberately leveled in places. These weren't natural pathways, Diego insisted. This was construction, ancient and intentional. The symbols appeared where the canyon walls widened slightly into a natural alcove, 3 separate panels of rock face, each covered with carefully incised markings. Geometric patterns primarily, circles within circles, diamond shapes, parallel lines creating a visual rhythm, but interspersed among these were representations that made the symbol's purpose clearer. Human figures with arms raised, what appeared to be animals, deer possibly, and repeated images that Diego identified as ceremonial objects or ritual implements. Maria photographed each panel methodically, her hands steady, despite the adrenaline. These were Tarahumara, absolutely. The style, the spiritual content, the careful placement, they represented somewhere between 500 and possibly 1,000 years of accumulated sacred knowledge, all rendered in stone that had protected them through centuries of weather and time. "This is a record," Diego whispered, more to himself than the group. They were marking a path. Each symbol is a prayer, a direction, a promise. They're telling us we're on the correct way. Luis, however, had noticed something else. The upper edges of the 3 panels bore marks that were clearly different in character. Fresh tool marks, made within perhaps the last 50 years. Someone had been here recently, chiseling away portions of the original symbols. The damage was intentional and systematic, removing specific elements while preserving others. It looked like vandalism, but it carried an odd precision, as though someone had been searching for something specific within the symbols themselves. "We're not the first recent visitors," Luis said quietly. The implication hung between them. Someone else knew about this place. Someone else had been here not long ago, looking for something. Tomás was already scanning the canyon walls, his hand shielding his eyes from the lowering sun. "We should move to higher ground before dark. There's a cave system about 1 kilometer ahead. We can camp there safely." Before they left the symbol panels, Maria traced her fingers along the ancient marks one final time, feeling the groove and weight of each incision. Her great-grandfather had stood here. Had he too noticed the fresh damage? Had he understood what it meant? The questions multiplied as they continued climbing, and the canyon shadows grew longer. If you're enjoying this adventure so far, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Chapter 4. The Cave Network. The cave entrance was barely visible, a vertical fissure in the canyon wall, narrow enough that they had to turn sideways to squeeze through. But once inside, the passage opened dramatically into a chamber so vast their flashlight beams couldn't reach the far wall. The air was cool and perfectly still, smelling of mineral deposits and accumulated age. Somewhere deeper, water dripped with the patience of millennia, each drop adding infinitesimally to the stone formations below. Tomás moved through the cave system with confidence, suggesting he'd sheltered here before. The network was extensive, multiple chambers connected by natural passages that didn't feel random, but rather like the deliberate result of water carving through soluble limestone over geological time. But as Diego explored with scientific precision, measuring and photographing, he discovered something that stopped him cold: handprints on the upper wall of the central chamber. They were old, created by pressing a hand against the stone and then rubbing pigment around it, a negative image technique used by indigenous peoples for thousands of years. The pigment was nearly gone, faded to barely perceptible shadow, but under the focused beam of Diego's flashlight, they became unmistakable, a gallery of hands, perhaps 30 or more, arranged in a spiral pattern that drew the eye toward the chamber's deepest point. "Children," Maria said, studying the smaller prints, "and adults. They came here together. This was important to them. Sacred, maybe." Luis discovered pottery shards near the chamber floor, fragments of vessels that Diego dated visually to the pre-Hispanic period, likely 4 to 5 centuries old. Unlike the exterior symbols, these artifacts showed no signs of recent disturbance. They'd been sheltered here, protected by the cave's envelope, preserved by accident through centuries. They set up camp near the chamber entrance, establishing watches to maintain a constant awareness of the canyon beyond. As darkness solidified outside, transforming the landscape into absolute black, Tomás shared what he'd observed but hadn't mentioned earlier. Men had been following them since the Red River crossing, not threatening, not approaching, but maintaining distance and interest. Rivals, after the same prize most likely. Or something worse, grave robbers who sold artifacts to private collectors across the border. "How much farther?" Luis asked, his voice tight. "1 more day's travel," Tomás replied. "Perhaps less. But tomorrow they'll try to interfere. They'll want to reach the shrine first, or prevent us from reaching it at all. Maria lay in her sleeping bag, listening to the eternal drip of water echoing through the chamber, thinking about the hands pressed into stone centuries ago. Those people had lived, struggled, built meaning into the landscape, and now strangers were racing to find what they'd hidden, driven by motivations those ancient hands wouldn't have understood or approved of. Chapter 5. The passage narrows. Morning brought unexpected rain, not heavy, but persistent, the kind that seeped into clothing and made the stones slick. Tomas wanted to move quickly through a passage he called the Throat, a series of narrow defiles that connected the cave system to the upper canyon system where the shrine supposedly lay hidden. The narrow sections were barely wide enough for someone of average build to pass through, and several required removing backpacks and sliding them ahead before following. It was in the deepest point of the Throat, where the walls seemed to compress the world into vertical stone, that they heard the voices above them, echoing, distorted by the canyon, but unmistakably voices calling back and forth. Their pursuers had decided to make themselves known. "Keep moving," Tomas commanded, his hand steady on his backpack strap. "Don't stop, don't respond. These passages come out at a point they can't easily reach. We'll lose them if we move quickly." But the passage wasn't cooperating. Where it should have ascended, it suddenly descended, dropping into a chamber partially filled with water, a cenote-like formation created by underground rivers. The water was clear enough to see the bottom, but deep, easily over their heads in several areas. Tomas studied it for a moment, then pointed to a series of hand-carved steps leading along the right wall, barely above water level. Recently maintained, algae growth suggested regular passage. "The shrine keepers," he said. "They built routes through here. They knew these passages better than any map could show." They traversed the water-level pathway slowly, pressed against the wall, their packs held high. Above, the voices continued sporadically, the pursuers trying to determine where they'd gone. The passage through the cenote chamber seemed to stretch forever, but finally opened onto solid ground beyond, a natural tunnel sloping upward toward what appeared to be another exit point. The collapse came without warning. Somewhere above them, either from the weight of recent rain or from stones dislodged by their pursuers, exploring the passages carelessly, rock began to fall. Not a catastrophic avalanche, but steady, dangerous debris that forced them to run, abandoning careful footing for speed. Dust choked the air, turning their flashlight beams into useless diffusion of light. When the sound stopped and the dust began to settle, they found themselves in a new chamber, one that took their breath away, not from exertion, but from what they saw. The shrine wasn't hidden underground. It was here, in this chamber, constructed with unmistakable intention. Chapter 6. The Shrine. The structure rose from the chamber floor like something impossibly preserved, a wall constructed from carefully fitted stones, each positioned with mathematical precision. But this wasn't the impressive part. The impressive part was what covered the wall's surface, a mural of remarkable complexity, rendered in pigments that had survived centuries through the cave's protective envelope. The mural depicted a landscape, mountains and valleys rendered with clear perspective. But overlaid on this landscape were ceremonial figures, arms raised in gestures of prayer or power. The sky portion of the mural showed celestial bodies, stars arranged in patterns that Diego immediately recognized as indigenous astronomical knowledge. The center of the composition featured a figure or deity form that drew the eye with its presence, its geometry suggesting profound spiritual significance. An altar of sorts sat before the wall, a stone platform with a shallow depression at its center. Remnants of offerings lay arranged carefully within, corn cobs suggesting ceremonial corn, smooth stones arranged in patterns, fragments of woven material that might have been cloth or ritual objects. Everything suggested this space had been actively maintained, used for spiritual purposes, treated as sacred by people who understood its significance and respected its power. "This is why the symbols guided us," Maria whispered, stepping closer to the mural. "This isn't treasure in the way we thought. This is memory. This is a record of what mattered to them." Diego was already photographing, his academic excitement temporarily overwhelming any other consideration. But Luis was studying the wall's upper portions, where something else caught his attention. More recent markings, crude and clearly made with different tools. Names carved into the stone, dates spanning decades, Tarahumara names, some repeated across different periods, suggesting generations of people returning to this place, adding their marks to this sacred space. And then they heard the gunshot. The report echoed through the chamber with stunning violence, followed by a voice, harsh and authoritative, demanding they move away from the mural immediately. 3 men emerged from the passage they'd just traversed, their leader armed, his companions carrying equipment that suggested archaeological experience corrupted by criminal intent. "This site belongs to our clients," the leader said, his accent suggesting origin somewhere in the capital's darker neighborhoods. "You've done useful work locating it. Now step back and we'll forget you were ever here." Tomas positioned himself between the gunman and the others. "This is sacred ground," he said quietly. "Your clients don't own it. Nobody owns it. It belongs to the ancestors and to anyone who respects its memory." The tension crystallized. The gunman raised his weapon, but in that moment the ceiling above them made a sound like breaking teeth. The recent rain had infiltrated deeper than anyone realized. The rock above the northern wall, the wall containing the mural, began to shift with an ominous groaning. If this treasure hunt already has you hooked, hit the like button. It helps us bring more forgotten stories to light. Chapter 7. The Collapse. The chamber didn't collapse so much as surrender to forces that had been waiting centuries to reassert themselves. The ceiling above the mural section fractured along pre-existing fault lines, and stone began falling not in a catastrophic rush, but in a terrible, methodical sequence. The gunman shouted orders, his weapon suddenly useless against geological inevitability. Everyone ran toward the exit passage simultaneously, abandoning strategy for survival. Maria grabbed for her camera, but Luis pushed her forward instead. The photograph would be worthless if they died in a cave collapse. The stone fell in pieces, some large enough to crush a person, others small enough to sting, but survivable. The mural fractured and crumbled, fragments of ancient pigment scattered across falling rock like colored dust. They reached the passage as a major section of the wall gave way, taking the altar with it, burying the offering stones under meters of collapsed stone. The mural was gone, not destroyed exactly, but buried, entombed beneath rock once again, perhaps protected, perhaps lost forever. The scientific part of Diego wanted to calculate the loss, quantify the historical significance, vanished in minutes, but survival took priority. The collapse also sealed the passage behind them. By the time they'd reached the higher chambers and emerged into open canyon air, the route they'd used to enter was completely blocked. Stone lay piled where passages had been, effectively erasing the internal pathways. Their pursuers were either ahead of them, which seemed unlikely, or still trapped behind the collapse. They emerged in the upper canyon as afternoon light was turning golden and heavy, the rain having passed, leaving everything dripping and clean. Behind them came the sound of Tomas moving through the passage, his form emerging from shadow as the cave sealed itself behind him. The gunman and his companions had not made it through. Chapter 8. What remained? The cave collapse had rendered the shrine inaccessible without professional excavation, if it remained accessible at all. The internal passages had shifted dramatically, effectively turning the geological formation into a sealed tomb. Everything they'd discovered, the mural, the altar, the offerings, was now protected and buried in equal measure. They descended the canyon in silence for several hours, processing what had happened. Luis was thinking about his business in Mexico City, realizing with sudden clarity that what mattered to him had shifted during these past 5 days. The construction contract seemed hollow now, measured against the weight of standing in a sacred space and recognizing something greater than profit. Diego was already mentally composing the academic paper that could never be published. Not with the cave sealed, not with the artifacts still buried, not with the mural existing now only in his photographs and memory. But those photographs themselves had value. They were documentation. Evidence that the shrine existed, that the Tarahumara had maintained sacred knowledge and space across centuries, that history was written in stone and pigment by people whose names were lost, but whose intentions remained legible. Maria held her camera, reviewing the images she'd captured before the collapse. The mural was recorded digitally now, preserved in pixels, if not in stone. Her great-grandfather's map had led them exactly where he intended. He'd known about the shrine, had documented its location, had passed the knowledge to the next generation, not as a mystery to be exploited, but as a trust to be honored. Tomás walked ahead, his path through the canyon automatic, his mind elsewhere. He'd brought this knowledge into being, had guided them honestly, had allowed the land itself to determine what happened. The shrine would remain sealed for now. Perhaps that was as it should be. Sacred things need protection, need distance from ambition. Chapter 9. The Legacy. The truck that had brought them into the mountains carried them back to Creel with the weight of experience that no journey by road could compress. At the government tourism office, Diego filed a preliminary report about the cave system's geological significance and historical markings, carefully written to suggest further research was needed without explicitly revealing the shrine's location. The authorities would eventually investigate, no doubt. Other explorers would eventually find what had been found, or they wouldn't. The landscape would keep its secrets, regardless of human intention. But for now, the knowledge remained with the family, passed down once more, from great-grandfather to his descendants, a chain of witnesses across time. Luis returned to Mexico City, but changed his business operations, beginning to specialize in historical restoration rather than new construction. Maria started a photography project, documenting Tarahumara cultural sites, working with community members who were themselves determined to preserve what colonial erasure had tried to eliminate. Diego submitted his research through academic channels, earning degrees and publications based on the experience, though always being careful to never quite reveal the shrine's exact location, maintaining the privacy the sacred site deserved. The leather journal was copied carefully, with the map reproduced and studied by multiple family members. But the original was given to a Tarahumara community center, returned to the people whose ancestors had created the shrine, whose hands had pressed into the cave walls, whose knowledge had been documented in symbols and mural and stone. It felt like the only choice that made sense, like closing a circle that had opened centuries before. 2 years later, news emerged that the sealed cave passage had partially reopened due to seasonal water flow and erosion patterns. A new team of archaeologists, working with Tarahumara community members who insisted on controlling the research process, carefully documented what remained. The mural had survived better than anyone expected, protected by stone and sealed atmosphere. The altar was recoverable. The offerings could be studied. But the most important discovery was this: the shrine wasn't a tomb or a hiding place. It was a gathering space, used continuously across centuries, maintained by people who understood that sacred places require care and respect. The handprints in the deeper chambers spanned generations, each mark a person saying, "I was here, I honor this, I pass this forward." That was the real treasure, not gold or artifacts or historical significance, but the understanding that meaning survives across time, that knowledge held lightly and shared with respect carries more weight than any material wealth. The Reyes family had followed a map drawn by someone who understood this. They'd discovered not a secret shrine, but a responsibility to honor the past by protecting what the past had cherished, and to pass that protection forward to whoever came next. The canyon still holds its mysteries. There are passages not yet explored, symbols not yet fully interpreted, stories that wait for the right people to find them. But some mysteries are meant to remain hidden, and some treasures are valuable precisely because they can't be possessed, only respected, only honored, only remembered. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of discovery and hidden history. See you in the next adventure.